Reliable, affordable, low-carbon energy across Asia and the Pacific. That's what's needed to power economic growth in one of the fastest-growing regions in the world. But with various Asian economies growing at different speeds, help is needed for their energy transition. Now, to explore this multifaceted problem, let's cross over now to Roland Lim, who's standing by at the Singapore International Energy Week Summit. Roland, what's the latest there?
Sarah, according to regional lender ADB, Asia accounts for an increasing share of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that's because growth in the region is highly dependent on polluting activities. And to help aid the regional energy transition, ADB has been helping to fund its climate financing needs. Now, joining me now to discuss the challenges is Ramesh Subramaniam. He is Group Chief of the Sectors Group at ADB. Ramesh, good to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Tell us, Southeast Asia is vulnerable, very vulnerable to climate change. I mean, rising sea levels, drought, floods. Has ADB actually seen a rise in the applications of post-disaster support?
Absolutely, yes, Roland. As you know, Southeast Asia is on the ring of fire. Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, many other countries. So there has been certainly an upswing in terms of our support, not just in terms of reactive financing. We also need to be proactive because the region, unfortunately, will continue to face more and more disasters to come. So we are positioning ourselves, and the region is positioning itself. If you look at many countries in the region, like Indonesia, Philippines has now become the host country for the Loss and Damage Secretariat. Laws and regulations are being adopted in many countries. ADB, for ourselves, we've just recently adopted a disaster risk management action plan, which jives very well with the climate change action plan that we also adopted about a year ago. In terms of contingent risk financing, it's very, very critical. It's not just public sector financing, but private sector financing also needs to happen. As you know, insurance penetration is very low in the region, less than 2% overall. And within that, if you're looking at disaster risk coverage for infrastructure assets, whether it's national large-scale assets or municipal assets, it's very low. And then the sector is in a very nascent stage. So at the ADB, we are working with a number of countries in the region to help on these fronts, Roland.
Okay, so what sort of percentage rise are we seeing in terms of disaster risk financing?
If you look at reactive financing, clearly there is significant financing that's going on, after an event has taken place. But the challenge that we face is that in terms of allocating from your fiscal resources, a certain portion of the budget to be ready to face disasters, that has been very, very slow. And if you look at insurance markets, I would say it's almost non-existent. For example, the Southeast Asia Disaster Risk Insurance Financing Facility has been in effect, but it tends to be quite small, and we are now collaborating with them in terms of expanding. This is an initiative that Japan and the ASEAN countries had initiated a few years ago. So you do need more market-based solutions because the challenge that we face, there is a clear market failure. How do we design infrastructure assets, particularly at the municipal, at the local government level? It's very, very challenging, Roland. So more needs to be done on both. But reactive financing significant, proactive financing is yet to take a swing.
So disaster risk financing aside, going back to mitigating the impacts of climate change, would it be fair to say that developed countries, for example, support from them is lacking? Because at COP28 in Dubai, $700 million was pledged by developed nations for new loss and the damage fund. Could they do better?
In terms of it's certainly a very important first step that countries had taken at COP28. Now the loss and damage fund has been established. The Secretariat is up and running on an interim basis. The new head of the Loss and Damage Fund has also been appointed. We are quite optimistic that there will be momentum. Now, clearly, in terms of financing, the challenge that we face is that given the scale of disasters, no amount of funding is going to be enough. So clearly, from 700, 800 million, there can be more support coming in. But what is very, very important is that countries do position themselves from the public sector point of view. But also, as I noted, markets need to develop, particularly insurance markets need to develop. And the culture of protecting ourselves against these large-scale disasters, there has to be a lot more awareness, policy, legal, regulatory frameworks also need to develop, Roland.
What would be your wish list at COP29?
We, at COP29, clearly it's been labeled as the financing COP. So we are quite optimistic, we are quite hopeful that there'll be more commitments. For example, for the loss and damage fund, there'll be more commitments coming in. Transition financing, Roland, is another critical area which is also being covered at the SIEW here this week. There is a lot of money going into green financing, sustainable financing. You look at low-hanging fruits such as renewable energy, green energy, and so on. But the challenge that we face is that in many countries, in order to get into green financing, you need to get out of brown assets. For example, closer to home here in Singapore, if you look at Indonesia, there is a lot of coal-fired assets, coal-fired power plants that are in operation, but it's not easy. Because it's very contextual. Energy security is very critical. Affordability is very critical. You need to make sure that any transition is just, is also quite critical. So transition financing, we are hopeful that at COP29 there will be momentum, Roland.
Going back to the energy trilemma, as it were, I mean, we're talking about energy security, affordability, sustainability. How would you get Asian countries to prioritize towards that energy transition?
In fact, actually, countries are positioning themselves quite effectively. So if you look at the net zero plans that have developed in many countries, in Southeast Asia, again, closer to home for us, there is certainly, well thought out plans that have emerged, like whether it's Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam. Of course, Singapore has been the leader in this, working with the Energy Markets Authority here, for instance. Now, in terms of what needs to be done is how do you move from plans to enabling environment so that both public and private investments could happen. The scale of financing is huge. I mentioned transition financing. To get out of brown assets to go into more green assets, you're going to need billions and billions of dollars. A few years ago, we estimated that climate-adjusted infrastructure needs in Southeast Asia are going to be in the order of about $200 billion. Sad to say, much of that is not coming. So clearly, given the climate challenges that we are going to face, how does the enabling environment keep evolving is going to be very critical, Roland.
And getting policymakers to talk to other stakeholders, energy providers, how should that happen?
The trilemma that you mentioned, clearly that's at the back of all policymakers' minds. Because, if you were to, from a legal point of view, if you were to change the power purchase agreement, that can be done. Financing can be arranged. But how do we make sure that the future alternative solutions that are emerging are affordable? And because technology is also evolving, so a number of parameters need to be taken into account. So bringing in civil society is very critical, like Indonesia, for example, Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, and then outside of the region in Pakistan, Kazakhstan. These are countries that we are working on energy transition. Their policymakers are very closely involved with civil society organizations. Labor is another important dimension that we need to take into account because millions of people are employed in the brown assets. So if you're moving them, how do you reskill and upskill them is also going to be critical. So all of these factors are coming into play, Roland, and we are quite optimistic because the challenges involved are very significant. If you look at the developed countries, they've been retiring more aged coal plants. Whereas if you look at Indonesia, the coal fleet is very young. So how do you really make those complex choices is actually quite challenging.
Okay, on that positive note, we'll have to leave it there. And that was Ramesh Subramaniam. He is Group Chief of the Sectors Group at the ADB.